there is a prayer that, instead of building up, weakens. A prayer that, far from uniting the soul to God, can, stealthily, entrench it in self-love. This is the central warning of St. Teresa of Ávila, Doctor of the Church and Mistress of the Interior Life. The spiritually decisive point she bequeathed to us is this: the greatest danger for progress in the life of prayer is not a lack of prayer, but prayer done incorrectly. The majority of people err, or have a superficial understanding, by confusing the essence of prayer, which is an act of love and surrender of the will, with the mere experience of consolation, emotional sweetness, or intellectual satisfaction. Many seek in prayer a state of personal well-being, a spiritual comfort, and thus build their entire spiritual life on the unstable sand of feeling, ignoring the solid rock of the will conformed to God. This error is not trivial. It has real and profound spiritual consequences: stagnation in illusion, vulnerability to temptation, sterility in apostolic fruitfulness, and the risk of abandoning the path at the first sign of divine aridity, which is often the very means God uses to purify and elevate the soul. This exposition will focus precisely on the teaching of St. Teresa of Ávila, as recorded in her foundational works, the Book of Her Life, the Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle. The central thesis is that according to Teresian doctrine, a poorly made prayer, one centered on self-seeking, on sensible consolations, and disconnected from the concrete practice of humility and charity, constitutes a formidable obstacle to true union with God. It is not a minor fault of beginners, but a strategic error that can misdirect an entire spiritual journey. The real spiritual consequences involve remaining in a state of spiritual infantilism, where the soul believes itself to be advanced because of the consolations it experiences, while in reality it is circling around its own ego, exposed to deception and incapable of sustaining the trials that lead to genuine mystical marriage. According to the writings of St. Teresa, particularly in The Way of Perfection, prayer is defined from the outset as a work of warriors. It is not a recreational activity for the soul, but a combat. She writes for her daughters, the Discalced Carmelites, with the clear objective that they be defenders of the Church through prayer and mortification. This foundational context is crucial. Teresa does not approach prayer as a theory of spiritual delights, but as an effective and demanding practice. The error she identifies, prayer poorly made, is therefore a failure in this spiritual combat. It is to mistake the battlefield, to polish one's own weapons instead of using them, to seek shelter instead of advancing. In her own life, as she recounts in The Book of Her Life, she experienced this error for nearly 20 years. A prayer life that sought pleasant conversations and consolations, but that left her will weak and attached to worldly vanities. It was only when she understood, under divine illumination and wise direction, that prayer required a firm determination to please God, and not to feel Him, that her path truly began. This personal experience grounds her teaching with exceptional authority. So, what exactly constitutes a poorly made prayer in the Teresian view? We can delineate its characteristics based on her own clear and repeated admonitions. The first and most fundamental characteristic is the search for consolations as an end in itself. Teresa states with disarming clarity, "The important thing is not to think much, but to love much." Many souls, she observes, make the grave mistake of measuring the quality of their prayer by the degree of sensible devotion they experience, tears, warmth, emotional sweetness, intellectual clarity. They become attached to these states, desire to reproduce them, and become discouraged or abandon prayer when they disappear. For Teresa, this is to build the spiritual life on a foundation of sand. In The Interior Castle, she explains that these consolations can be given by God to encourage beginners, as a mother gives milk to a child. However, clinging to them, seeking them, and considering them a sign of great progress is spiritual childishness. Worse still, she warns with acute psychological and spiritual discernment, these consolations can have a natural origin, from a melancholy temperament, a fervent imagination, or even physical causes, or, in more serious cases, a preternatural origin used by the enemy of human nature to imprison a soul in self-complacency and vanity. The true work of prayer, the one that builds the interior castle, occurs in the will. It is the will, often in aridity and dryness, that chooses to remain in faith, in patience, and in love for God, even when feeling nothing. This is the prayer that fortifies. The second characteristic of a poorly made prayer is intellectualism, or imaginative excess without engagement of the will. Saint Teresa valued meditation on the mysteries of Christ's life and recommended it, especially for those beginning the practice of mental prayer. However, she vehemently warned against what she called a great deal of brain work. Some souls, she says, spend all their prayer time constructing elaborate scenes in their imagination or reasoning exhaustively about theological concepts. They finish their prayer mentally fatigued, but with the heart untouched and the will unmoved. They believe they have prayed well because they were thinking about holy things, but if that thought did not culminate in an act of love, a desire to please God, sorrow for sin, or a firm resolution to practice a virtue, it was more akin to a study session than to prayer. The writings indicate that for Teresa, mental prayer must always tend toward a colloquy, a heart-to-heart conversation with someone who is present. It is not an exercise in personal rhetoric or an interior cinematography. When the soul becomes enamored with its own ideas and scenes, it is admiring its own work, not encountering God. This is a subtle and common form of spiritual vanity. The third characteristic, and perhaps the most pragmatically decisive in Teresa's teaching, is the disconnect between prayer and mortification, between the intimacy of the cell and the practice of charity in daily life. Here lies one of the most severe and luminous points of her doctrine. Prayer and life are inseparable. She states without room for ambiguity that it is impossible to advance in genuine prayer without simultaneously cultivating humility, detachment from created things, and fraternal love. In The Way of Perfection, she dedicates entire chapters to explaining how these virtues are the essential foundation. She uses strong and concrete images. Wanting to build a high tower of prayer without the foundation of humility is a foolish endeavor that will end in ruin. Therefore, a poorly made prayer is one that the person uses as a spiritual refuge, a private comfort zone that does not overflow into the transformation of their character and actions. It is the prayer of someone who perhaps experiences sweetness in recollection, but then, outside of that time, is irritable, attached to their own opinions, resistant to obedience, neglectful of community duties, or indifferent to the needs of their sisters, or, for lay people, family, and neighbors. For Teresa, such a disparity is the clearest proof that prayer is illusory. True prayer, even if experienced in aridity, necessarily produces fruits in life, greater patience, a desire to serve, joy in abnegation, and a sincere love for others, especially those who cause us discomfort. The fourth characteristic is inconstancy and a lack of method, driven by the search for novelty and emotional satisfaction. Saint Teresa, despite describing the highest mystical states, was profoundly practical. She knew that an undisciplined soul is a plaything of its own moods. A poorly made prayer is one practiced only when one feels like it, or that constantly changes methods and points of meditation in search of a new stimulus, a new consolation. She recommended, especially for beginners, firmness and perseverance in the method, particularly the prayer of recollection. This prayer consists of gently withdrawing the senses from external distractions and placing oneself with simplicity in the presence of God. To abandon prayer at the first sign of dryness or distraction, or to jump from one spiritual book to another in search of a technique that will provide consolation, is, in her view, a sign of weakness and a lack of serious determination. The tradition she established in her monasteries included specific and fixed times for mental prayer, creating a structure that protects the will from the variability of feelings. Perseverance in dry and difficult prayer is, for her, of much greater value than many consolations received in passing. Why does the saint attribute such grave spiritual consequences to this error? Because, according to the spiritual theology she embodies, prayer is the primary channel of grace for the soul's transformation. A blocked or contaminated channel does not irrigate the garden. The plants of virtue wither. A soul that practices a self-referential prayer, centered on its own states, is not opening itself to the true transformative action of God. The consequences are multiple and serious. First, spiritual illusion. The person may believe they are advancing because they experience certain interior phenomena, visions, locutions, raptures of feeling, while in reality, they may be stagnating in spiritual self-love. Teresa constantly warns about the danger of these phenomena, urging that they always be met with humility, distrust of self, and submission to wise spiritual direction. Second, vulnerability to temptation. A soul not fortified by true prayer, which is an exercise of humility and abandonment, is easy prey for temptations against patience, chastity, and charity. It may have beautiful prayers and then break out in anger over a trivial matter, or judge a neighbor harshly. The prayer did not forge a strong will. Third, sterility. The ultimate goal of Teresian prayer is apostolic, to intercede for the church, to support preachers and theologians, to save souls. A selfish prayer, focused on one's own spiritual comfort, produces no fruits for the mystical body of Christ. It is a spiritual dead end. Fourth, and most serious, the risk of abandonment and despair. St. Teresa warns that God, in his merciful pedagogy, often withdraws all consolations from a soul that has become attached to them. He allows a painful and purifying aridity so that the soul learns to seek him, and not his gifts. For a soul unprepared for this purification, believing itself to be advanced due to past consolations, this aridity can be a devastating trial. It may believe that God has abandoned it, that its past experiences were illusions, and may even give up the life of prayer entirely. This is why building on the solid foundation of self-denial and love of the will is so crucial. Having exposed the pitfall, it is necessary to define, according to St. Teresa, what constitutes a well-made prayer. It is mental prayer, practiced with humility, perseverance, and a focus on conforming one's will to God's will. It begins with an act of faith in the real presence, placing oneself, with simplicity, in the company of Christ. Not necessarily to imagine him visually, but to know with the certainty of faith that he is present, seeing and listening. Then, using a point of meditation, a passage from the Gospels, a mystery of the Passion, an attribute of God, not to exhaust its intellectual meaning, but to stir the affections of love, gratitude, repentance, or desire. From this meditation, the soul should move naturally to colloquy, speaking to the Lord as one speaks to a trusted friend, a father, a spouse. The content of this colloquy is essential. It should not be a mere repetition of formulas or a monologue about one's own problems. It should be a dialogue that leads to offerings and resolutions. Lord, even though I feel nothing, I believe you are here. I do not seek consolations. I seek you. Give me the strength to bear this annoyance today for love of you. Here is my will. Conform it to yours. What do you want from me in this situation? For Teresa, a single Our Father prayed in this way, with attention and love of the will, is worth infinitely more than many rosaries recited mechanically while the mind is elsewhere. The indispensable foundation of this entire structure is humility. St. Teresa insists that the door to entering the mansions of the interior castle is humility, and she clarifies, humility is not a feeling of worthlessness. It is the factual, lived recognition of one's own nothingness and total dependence on God. This is why she so valued the practice of self-knowledge, a soul that truly knows itself, its propensity for sin, its weakness, its constant need for grace, cannot fall into the vanity of believing its consolations are a merit of its own efforts. It receives everything as an unmerited gift and perseveres in aridity without complaint, knowing it deserves nothing. This humility is cultivated and proven not in the isolation of the oratory, but in the daily embrace of humiliations, in obedience to superiors, and to the demands of community life, in preferring others, in joyful and hidden service. The prayer irrigates this practice, and this practice gives truth and solidity to the prayer. The teaching of Saint Teresa of Ávila on poorly made prayer is, therefore, a call to spiritual maturity and doctrinal soundness. It is a powerful corrective in any era, but especially in a contemporary context that often confuses spirituality with emotional self-help, that seeks experiences rather than surrender, and that values consolation over the cross. Her message is starkly clear. There are no shortcuts on the path to union with God. The path is that of the gospel, denial of self, taking up one's cross daily, and following Christ. Prayer is the essential means on this path, but only if it is made correctly, with a pure intention to please God, with a will ready for sacrifice, and with fruits evident in charity. To ignore this warning is to risk building a magnificent castle in the air, which will vanish at the first storm of trial. To heed it is to begin, with realism and confidence, the construction of the interior castle, whose foundation is humility and whose pinnacle is transforming union with the divine majesty.